we're going to take a second look at Dave Brubeck. Very adventurous character and very prolific character as well. A lot of interests, and had a little help from his wife in some of these. So let's get started. After timeout, which was 5-4 and 7-4 and that, he decided to continue with his explorations with time. I think it was called further timeout, or timeout further, or further out timeout. He's just going further out with these meters, man. So now we're getting a lot of 7-4, not just 5-4, we're getting 10-4, 11-4, and 9-8, and all sorts of various meters that were definitely not common to jazz, and yet he was able to create grooves within these odd meters. By this time in the 60s, he was doing, oh my God, probably with his classic quartet with Desmond and Morello and Wright. They were doing probably 4 albums a year, as well as touring and their other various projects. So they were quite busy and quite prolific, in several albums, and most of them dealing with his explorations with time, with various meters that were not common to jazz. At the same time, he had a passion for, how shall we say this, awakening the public to the beauty of jazz, and through media, through radio. And he was able to realize that when in the early 60s he was a program director for a radio station, and convinced that radio station in the LA area to go 24/7 jazz. That's right, you can listen to jazz 24/7 and not just Sirius radio. That didn't exist back in these days. Yeah. He had a neighbor, African-American gentleman named John E. Metz, who was one of the biggest radio personalities and executives in the country, perhaps in history. And working with John E. Metz, he was able to turn the format of this radio station from part-time jazz to full-time jazz, and that was a big thing for him, because now you got jazz listeners who don't have to wait till 9 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock at night or midnight. They can tune in to jazz all day long. And so can young students, and so can educators, and so can the general public. So he's moving the acceptance, the knowledge and acceptance of this music forward. This really, really was a passion of his, and he achieved that in the early 60s as well. At the same time, he became very reflective of his work as a jazz ambassador, doing trips around the world for the State Department. And he and his wife wrote a musical called The Jazz Ambassadors, that kind of picked music from various corners of the globe and put it inside a jazz framework. And that musical was recorded and featured the likes of Louis Armstrong and Connie McRae and others. So he reached out to some of the best and brightest and most talented to bring this idea into realization. And this is all with the help of his wife, Lola. I think this entire musical was performed as a part of the Monterey Jazz Festival in the mid-60s. He began to use a clarinetist with his quartet when Desmond was not available. I think Desmond started pursuing his own career as a solo artist, and when they had contractual issues or scheduling issues, he used his clarinetist. So I think he did 3 or 4 albums with a clarinetist, and most of the work on that album was a composition of the clarinet artist himself. So that's an interesting sideline, so to speak, of his work. He also was reflective of the places he traveled with the quartet. And so he did an album called Reflections of the USA, where he is talking about music they encountered as they traveled through the country, our regional music, whether it's Appalachia or the Southwest or in the South in the blues or whatever that is. He kind of codified that and put it into that particular album. He also had a fondness for Japan. So he also did an album called Impressions of Japan, and great individual songs, and that was also in its entirety a great album. And of course, who can ever do an album about any place on the earth and not have reflections of New York with all of its diversity? So yes, there was an Impressions of New York, or Reflections of New York as well, album that was recorded during this period of time, as well as all of the other projects he's doing. The original quartet reconstituted itself with the return of Desmond, and they did a few albums in the late 60s, but their swan song was an album called The Last Time We Were Together in Paris. So kind of like a great swan song there. Paris is a great place to be, and people normally have a whole lot of fun there. Dave Brubeck obviously had a great personality, was very open to all of the influences of his environment and of his time. He never did a whole lot with electronics except for when he added his sons later in life, and one was actually an electric bass player. But his, I won't say preoccupation, his experimentation with various rhythms, his ability to do what we might even call program music, to do reflections of Japan, reflections of US, or reflections of New York, or the real ambassadors, as he takes a look at the influences he had faced as he traveled the world as an ambassador for the State Department. All of those things came together in the 60s, and I think he was probably very happy that he got to get his project, a full-time jazz radio station, alive and kicking, and was able to work with his wife in creating and delivering a complete musical based on the jazz experience while touring. Dave Brubeck, complicated figure, very prolific figure, and someone that we need to remember and revisit often, because there are all sorts of hidden gems out there other than Take 5 and Blue Rhonda a la Turk. Thank you very much.